morning, everyone. Today is September 23rd, 2021, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong Moton in the spring of 2020. Every week, Jean Lawler and I are so happy and excited to bring another great webinar to everyone. And there's no charge for these wonderful webinars. Rather, we ask people to contribute to a food bank and help fight food insecurity worldwide if they like what they see. And one of my favorite parts of the webinar every week is when we announce the running total of how much our generous audiences have contributed to food banks since the series began. So Jean, a virtual drum roll, and please let us know the total.
Ta-da! Well, today we're up to $171,950. So we're getting close to the $200,000 mark. But in terms of translating that to number of meals, that depending on which food bank's numbers, you use the formula, it's at least 2 million meals, if not more than 2 million meals that have been served, thanks to the generosity of the participants in Will Work for Food.
Amazing. Thank you so much to the legal and ADR communities for being so very, very generous fighting food insecurity. And now to our program for the day. We're so excited to have Professor G. Richard Schell from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania talking to us today. Professor Schell is the author of so many important books in the fields of negotiation, Bargaining for Advantage, the classic, been in print well over 20 years and translated into so many languages and used in so many, the curricula of so many schools, and this wonderful book, The Conscience Code, another fantastic book. And I'll read you what it says about Professor Schell. G. Richard Schell is the Thomas Gerrity Professor of Legal Studies, Business Ethics, and Management at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of Bargaining for Advantage, The Art of Woo, and the award-winning Springboard, Launching Your Personal Search for Success. He led the most recent redesign of the Wharton School's MBA curriculum and helped create its required responsibility and business course, which inspired the Conscience Code. He has 2 grown sons and lives with his wife, Robbie, near Philadelphia in Wynwood, Pennsylvania. So like they do on late night television, we plug the book, Richard, we plug the book. So now we'd love to turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about the food bank, or you would encourage contributions if people are in a position to contribute. And then your presentation, our new friend, Professor Richard Schell, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Jeff, Jane, and Natalie for inviting me on. This is one of those intentions that's been a long time in the birthing since we started talking about this last spring, and we finally found a date, so it's a pleasure. So my food bank is Philabundance, philabundance.org, and it's a group that we've had a long-standing relationship with, Robbie and I. They are really the largest food bank in the city, and they do a terrific job. They're very professional. They're very generous, and they've done a lot of innovative things over the years, especially collecting food from restaurants and making sure nothing gets wasted, and in the pandemic especially really going into high gear to handle the emergency and the food insecurities that people face and still face. So that's my preferred group to be generous to. In line with that, though, I can't help but also plug and mention, I have a long-standing relationship with the United Food and Commercial Workers. I've worked with them for about 15 years and helped them with their collective bargaining groups and stuff. And they represent all the checkout people at Kroger's, and they do a lot of work in the delivery space. And I think, in addition to the people that have been helping with the food insecurities of the population that's been disenfranchised, I think a lot of times the people who are on the front lines keeping the food in the stores under this emergency, don't get quite the same attention as maybe the nurses do. but they're a very important part of the process of keeping us all fed too. So just give them a little plug because they're really great people. Okay, so I thought it's a daunting thing to talk to talk with lots of very experienced people, and people who do a lot of very high consequence fraught work to try to make peace between people who would rather fight, or at least they think they'd rather fight. And I come up from this in the long way. I was a fellow at the program of negotiation at Harvard Law School many years ago, and worked with Howard Rafa and Roger Fisher and all those folks. And getting to Yes with the text that I cut my teeth on, Bargaining for Advantage, was sort of my answer for that text. In the end, having investigated the folks at Harvard, especially Roger Fisher, I realized that at least this is my perspective, and before I wrote Bargaining for Advantage, Getting to Yes is a book about how to cooperate for someone who's really competitive. Because once if you ever got to know Roger Fisher, he was a competitive guy, and he was kind of learning to be collaborative and cooperative as a result of his work in international relations and making peace and all the good work they do at the program. And so if the interesting data point for that is the word leverage never appears in Getting to Yes. And as I entered my professional life at the Wharton School of Business, which is a deal-making environment, not a conflict resolution environment, I was using Getting to Yes, and I realized I was teaching deal makers with the wrong book. It's a conflict management book, and a very, very good one. And I teach it as a conflict management book with Bargaining for Advantage as the deal-making book. And so I actually had a chance to build on the platform that they had and offer perspectives that were much more like how people actually do deals, and a little less about how they manage conflicts. And interest, of course, the currency of our all collective work is common to both areas. Finding out what people really need, what they want, is the currency of the realm to both doing deals and also helping them unpack conflicts when they get off the rails. So that's not a quibble with that. But in my view, there's no such thing as an objective criteria. There's just the criteria people either use or believe in. And if you believe in it, then it looks objective, but that probably isn't going to be shared by everyone in the room, whatever your view is. So I'm gonna talk for a bit, and I'm really open to. Jeff and Jean assured me that they're gonna interrupt me and pepper me with whatever questions come up in the chat or anything else, and I'm totally comfortable and happy, getting as far or as not as far as I do in this slide deck. But I tried to think, what could I offer this group, very experienced people, by way of some perspectives that they may not have thought as much about as some others. And so I try to look back on a number of my different books and the way I teach, because I have a course for executives at Wharton on negotiation, but I also have a course on strategic persuasion. And so I've actually done a lot of work combining these subjects in a way that I thought you might find interesting, as a way of parsing out what's really going on in this human communication process that we all have to engage in. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll just take it from there and see if I can get this up. So can you all see this? Is that part? Yep. Okay.
I think so.
Okay, now I have to figure out how to advance the slides, because here we go. Next. Okay, now it should work. Good. Okay, so these are, I've got actually a fifth book called Make the Rules or Your Rivals Will. That's about strategic uses of law in commercial life. But these are the four that are much more psychological and process oriented. And the Conscience Code is the most recent one. It's about standing up for values in a workplace setting. So it's not so much about resolving conflict as instigating it when the stakes are high enough to be worth instigating it, and then how to do it effectively so that you don't end up having to leave your job or injuring your credibility, but you do it in a way that advances the goal. So that's the array of things. And today I'm going to talk about 4 different topics. One, a model I have of where negotiation and conflict fit into this overall picture of interpersonal influence. Talk a bit about the foundations for credibility as a psychological factor, which is really important for all mediators and the kind of thing you guys check off quickly, but also affects the perceptions of your parties vis-a-vis each other. And then bring a persuasion frame to parsing conflict, a model I call PCAN, which I'll explain when we get there. And then the very vital importance of what lawyers sometimes call the $1-million metaphor, which is the metaphor that allows a tort lawyer to convince a jury that either their client has a claim worth compensating, or if you're a defense lawyer, a claim that shouldn't be allowed. But communicating with ordinary people involves images, analogies, figures of speech that I think are vital tools, and I'll just remind us about that. And then look at personality as a factor, which is in Bargaining for Advantage. I understand you were sent a copy of the version of the personality assessment that I've created for that book. That it comes out of the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument, which is an older and more expensive way to parse the same subject. So I tried to reproduce it in a way that's more related to negotiation, and also that doesn't cost $40 a person to use. So I got a copyright cleared by a very important and is distinguished copyright law firm in Washington, D.C. So I made sure to keep it straight. So let's start with the circles of influence. So the way I see the topic that we are engaged in every day when we're mediating or negotiating is that there are 3 things going on, not one. And the biggest outside envelope is influence. And that is, what are people's perceptions of you? And the most important concept within that is credibility, which I'm going to get to in a second once I just show my perception of what these topics are that we engage in and how they relate to one another. So as I see it, influence is everything you do, verbal and nonverbal, accidentally on purpose, how you dress, whether you speak the language of the other party, whether you are on time, what they think about these important dimensions of you, especially against their expectations. So, for example, if you're in a situation in which telling the truth, you would normally think would be something that would add to your influence, is something that actually the circumstances are such that you'd be an idiot if you didn't tell the truth, then you're not going to get a lot of influence by telling the truth. You're going to get a pass. They're going to say, well, this person's got their head screwed on. That's good. They told the truth. But you're not going to get a lot of credit for it. So a lot of influence on the positive side comes from doing stuff that's above their expectations on these virtues. You're more reliable, you're more truthful, you're more compassionate than they had a reason to expect. And then, your currency goes up a little. And of course, you can fall short of expectations. And if you're Mother Teresa and you get caught lying once about some small matter, then you lose influence because you're Mother Teresa and everybody expected you to be a saint. So expectations are the baseline. We'll get to that in a second. But managing them is a critical skill as a result of that. A special kind of influence, as I see it, is persuasion. And we persuade by offering reasons, justifications, data that they will find appealing. So Aristotle pretty much summed up the secret of successful persuasion: know your audience. That's his critical message in the rhetoric. And so that's why it matters so much how you prepare for the group that you're working with, because all of us have our favorite reasons and our favorite data and our favorite justifications that we think are the right and winning ways to think about something. But it will be unpersuasive. You'll be right, but you'll be unpersuasive if you don't think about the reasons and the evidence and the justifications that's going to appeal to them. And that is a critical part of preparation in many, many ways. Now notice, I haven't even gotten to negotiation yet. One of the things that I offer in Bargaining for Advantage that is in distinction to getting to yes has to do with this very point. Because My sense is that there are no objective criteria unless it's in physics, and even that is pretty contested depending on the era that you're in. What I say about standards is that they're powerful when they're the standards the other guy believes in, the other side believes in, or that the people believe in, and that they're not powerful when they don't. So then you have a pathway to persuading them, which is offering the evidence and arguments that the standard is in fact fair, or that it's reasonable, or that it's been used many times, or whatever. But until they believe in the standard, it doesn't really have much traction. That's different from just interest. They're going to do it because it's in their interest to do it. One of my favorite quotes of all time is J.P. Morgan, the banker in the 19th century, who said, with a slight modification of gender pronouns, there are two reasons for everything a person does: a good reason and the real reason. And the good reason is usually the standard. It's company policy that we have to do this, or it's good for the community that we have to do this. But the real reason is usually related to interests. We'll gain more, we won't lose as much, we'll be more influential, we'll be more powerful, we'll have more people following us if this result happens. So the only reasons that really count are the reasons the other side actually believes in. They're not just good reasons, they're the reasons they believe in. And that's when you get some traction in a mediation, when you offer a justification for an outcome that connects to their way of thinking and say, this is something that a member of your spiritual community would find resonant with this value. I would like you to just consider that as a frame of reference as you consider this proposal, or it might be something relating to the importance of family, if that's a high priority, as opposed to just financials, or it may be financials because you've been appealing to their sense of compassion and actually they don't have one. So persuasion happens with reasons, and fairness is a very big part of our discussion in mediation and negotiation that involves persuasion. Then we get to negotiation, which does involve the core of our motivations. People negotiate because they have needs and fears. Just like a snail will move toward food and move away from threat, humans will move toward what they desire and away from what makes them anxious and insecure. And so the negotiation process, as I see it, is the core kind of the core middle part of your brain where emotions dwell. And that means that you have all of the human system in play when you negotiate, because you are working with their perceptions, which is intuitions, instant judgments, prejudices, biases, all the stuff that's just happening at light speed that's forming their impressions about people. Then you have persuasion, which is the cognitive part of the landscape, and you're offering things to try to change their picture in their head about some part of what's happening, what's true, what's going to happen in the future, what's fair. All these are cognitive things. We have to process them in a deliberative way. And then in the middle is the emotion. And that's why it's so important to read others' faces when you're working with them directly, because the emotions are hard to hide. It's so important to hear the pauses between what they say, because you're sensing that they might be going through some sort of operation where they're going to deceive to protect a position or to protect a fact. And you're making judgments and interpretations about that, but that's all we have about other people, are reading their affect. So you have to be a real master of reading other people to be good as a negotiator or mediator, because of course, if we had another circle in this, it would be dispute management and mediation inside the negotiation, because I think that's a special form of negotiation. But in my view, you can't negotiate without also persuading and influencing, and I don't think you can mediate without knowing a lot about negotiation, persuasion, and influence. They're all tightly connected. You can persuade without negotiating. We can have a seminar about whether Pluto is the final planet in the solar system and offer lots of evidence about that and dispute it and have conflicts over it, but we're not negotiating it. That's not something where someone's needs and fears, other than their career interests in the science community, are going to be triggered. So I just want to make one distinction before I move on here, because I found it a revelation myself after I wrote Bargaining for Advantage, and I started to write The Art of Woo, which is winning others over. It's the art and science of selling ideas. There are two completely different kinds of conflicts, and one is much more difficult than the other. And they relate to this, they both bring influence to the table, but a persuasion problem, the nuttiest and hardest persuasion problem, is a conflict over beliefs. People have fixed ideas, worldviews, things that they're completely wrapped up with in their identity about who they are and what the world means. And that conflict over beliefs, in my view, is the hardest possible conflict to manage. And I ended up coming to the conclusion after studying this for a while that we never, ever persuade someone to change a belief. Never. And so it's futile to think that you have that power, that you can offer an argument or evidence that will change someone's belief. What we can do is offer evidence, arguments, persuasion templates, and different things, and then give them enough space so that they change their own belief. And that's a different kind of challenge than thinking that you can go into a meeting and change someone's mind about a belief. And the second kind of conflict is actually easier, and that's conflict over interest. And the conflict over an interest is where we negotiate. There's something scarce, it has to be allocated, and we want to offer some version of it for them in order for them to give something else to us that we need. And there's an exchange of some sort, whether it's over time or at a simultaneous exchange, where we craft agreements that meet interests and needs. And you probably realize a lot of times in a mediation, and people start to argue, and your instinct says, let's agree to disagree about that, and let's move on to our interests. And what you've really encountered is a disagreement about beliefs. And you're smart enough to know that's not going to have any cheese for the mediation process. So let's abandon it. But when what is being offered conflicts with a belief, then you mix the two up. And there's really, that's concrete. When you mix a conflicting interest with a conflicting belief, then you have a kind of real concrete that requires some other modes to get people to move off of them. And I think this is my theory. I don't know any more about this than all of you do, but I think that's why our politics today are so fraught, because what used to be the process of sort of having political positions and then negotiating to common ground on underlying interests and needs has now gotten rigidified by polarized beliefs about what's legitimate, and it's mixed in with those interests. And so when you offer a compromise that might advance interests, people see it as disrespectful to their beliefs. And so the compromise is no longer possible because we can't unpack these two things. They've gotten thoroughly mixed up, and it makes it very, very difficult to find the art of compromise, because we don't compromise our beliefs about what's ethical. You don't trade. Well, I'll tell you what, you can lie, this much if I can lie that much. Just not the currency that we use to talk about beliefs. And so we're in a tough spot because these two things have gotten mixed up. They've always been mixed up for some people, but they've gotten mixed up for a lot of people. And so we're in a pickle. We'll see. We've got a reality check coming down the pike pretty soon, because Biden, who's an old school negotiator from the Senate, is trying to bring his team into the White House and say, hey, let's get back to interest here. And his own team is divided on the question of beliefs. And they may be willing to burn down the House because their belief that climate change or social inequality or whatever it is the number one, and they're not willing to say that anything else can be number one. And so, they'll bring down the House. I hope not, but that's the problem. Okay, so this is a model, and credibility, I'll just bring these up quickly. is this influence sector. And this is, again, stuff you all know. It's intuitive, but I do break it out in a way that makes it easier to kind of contextualize. And basically, this is a sort of 80-20 rule. These are the 20% of the factors that make up 80% of people's perceptions of your credibility. And it means that they have to know it. Credibility is not something you have. Credibility is a gift other people give you based on their perceptions that you have the right authority, that you know what you're talking about, that you have experience and competence based on hard-won trial and error, wins and losses, you're battle tested, and so your advice is going to have some wisdom in it because of competence. And notice the difference between expertise and competence. They're related. You can gain expertise by adding to your competence. But credibility for competence is they know you've done it a lot and done it well. Credibility for expertise is my first slide. I got these 4 books up there. And people go, oh, that guy's an expert, he wrote some books. But if I'm going to have surgery down here at the University of Pennsylvania on a hernia or something, I'm not really looking for the person who wrote the book on hernia operations. I'm kind of interested in the person who does them 20 times a week to work on me, because every case is its own individual item on the distribution of outcomes. And the surgeon who does it 20 times a week will see my little hernia and go, oh, look, this is, I've only seen this twice in the last year. And then they get to apply that problem-solving skill. That's not the ideal model. It's the experience that makes it possible for them to be good at it. And of course, all of you know that as a result of your experience as mediators. And then finally, the last one is trust. And trust is, it's funny how this topic works, isn't it? You have influence, which is a fuzzy word. You unpack it, you get to credibility, which is a fuzzy word. You unpack it, and you get to trust, which is a fuzzy word. So it's fuzzy words all the way down. It's like turtles all the way down. So what about trust? So I've investigated trust a little more, and this actually comes from some work I did with the FBI in their hostage coding programs down in Quantico. They sent some folks up to our programs. I went down and worked with them in theirs. And, they kind of taught me that, trust comes from a lot of things. It comes from being reliable, honest, has all the Aristotelian virtues associated with trust. But there's a trigger that causes trust to occur and that causes it to disappear in a very short amount of time. And the trigger, which a hostage negotiator has to establish in very fraught conditions with someone who's very, very in crisis, is the perception that the other party is there to help them, to advance their goals, and to give them things that they need at some sacrifice to their own goals. So, you can gain sort of reciprocity-based relationship with someone by giving and taking in equal measure. But if you want to gain trust with someone, you have to go out of your way and show them that you're willing to do stuff that's inconvenient or that might make you vulnerable or that might show your weakness. And you all know this from mediations where you've had a trouble establishing rapport, but then you found a place where you can share something about yourself that you didn't have to share, that shows you're not perfect or that shows you suffered, and that makes you a human, and the other person suddenly sees you in a different light. And it's not just that they see you as having a common background. There's something about the vulnerability that causes this trigger to happen. Now, in business, in negotiations, trust comes from the same thing, but it means that you do favors for people that are out of the way and without looking for a quid pro quo. As soon as you start looking for a quid pro quo, it becomes reciprocity again. And the magic sauce is this: I'm willing to rely on them. Now, the reason I say the trigger is important is because we all know how easy it is to lose trust. And all it takes to lose trust is to do one self-interested thing that confirms their hypothesis that you were actually in it for yourself all the time. And now whatever judgment they may have had that you were kind of in a special category disappears. And winning it back, that perception that you're there as a partner to help them is much more difficult than establishing it in the first place. So I think, looking for all those opportunities to build credibility based on trustworthiness is not just, are you as reliable as they expected? It's, are you as more reliable than they expected? Are you more honest than they expected? Are you more compassionate than they expected? And how can you bring that spark to this interaction that allows that magic to happen? Now, as I'm going to leave this topic, but I just want to point out something, because in the wake of my study of this, I realized that there are only two types of people that are truly gifted at establishing trust. And none of us are these two types. So that's why it's so hard for us. The first type is a saint, and they are living lives of self-sacrifice in which they've built that credibility based on being self-sacrificing over so long a period that, and they've done so much good in the world by doing that, that we just give them our respect and trust as a result of their sainthood. The second are psychopaths. Psychopaths are glib, charming, crafty, mentally damaged people who are gifted with one skill and they have an entire deficit on the other one, both of which are important in interpersonal negotiations and mediation. The gift they have is reading other people's needs and fears. They're good at perspective taking. They're excellent at saying, what's really motivating this person? What do they want? What's the hook that will get them to move toward me? What's missing is empathy. They have no compassion whatsoever. And so you combine those two, you've got a really, really dangerous combination. And as fate would have it, somewhere between 1% and 3% of people, and the 3% represents business and law a little more than the rest of the community, are psychopaths. They're clinical psychopaths. Now, that doesn't sound like a high number, but if you have 1 million people, that's a lot of psychopaths. And they don't come with a sign like labeling themselves. Like Bernie Madoff, the most recent, very famous version of this, is someone who operated for 30 years, and he's definitely a psychopath. But he was able to manage everyone's perceptions of credibility by being the head of the NASDAQ, by being an expert in investments, by beating the market year after year after year, and by having this, we're in it for you. We're gonna, we're gonna help the temple with their fundraising. We're gonna, help make sure the opera stays in good shape. And it was just a big Ponzi scheme, and he was enriching himself. But there you are. He got away with it for 30 years because he had all the indicia of credibility, and he was utterly trustworthy to his audience, but completely untrustworthy as a human. So don't think you have some gift that you can spot these people. They're hard to spot. And that's why it's so difficult to trust others. So I think somewhere in our subconscious, evolution has programmed us to be somewhat suspicious when we have this feeling of trust emerging, and we ask ourselves, are we ready, for this? That's why marriage is such a fraught and kind of incremental process to find a life partner that we're actually going to believe in for the rest of our lives. It takes time. It's rare, and I think it's because it's there's a possibility, not trivial but not common, that you're dealing with someone who's going to get you to do all the collection of marbles, and then they're going to take them all and then disappear in the sunset. So just keep this in mind. Now, a little bit of persuasion arguments that are in the persuasion literature. And I think this pecan idea, which I'm going to unpack for you so you know what it means in a second, helps you understand where you get disagreements over beliefs in a process of conflict management. Because Aristotle and the great rhetoricians of the classical world taught us that there are many standard forms of argument. There are arguments toward whether to argue on behalf of a matter of truth. There are arguments about a matter of morality. And then there's an argument of what they call the matter of policy, which is a policy argument is an argument over what to do next, which is the most common argument you have in mediation, the most common one we have in organizational life. What should we do next? And when we have that argument, cognitive psychology has actually reinforced this classic insight. Humans process this in 4 steps with 4 questions. And the first question is when the question comes out, what should we do next? Everybody immediately wants to say, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And if you have disagreements about what the problem is, then you're stuck. You can keep going and arguing, but if they don't think that problem is the same as you do, or the two parties in the mediation don't think it's the same problem, you're just talking out the window and you haven't connected them yet. So one of the things about this, you have to keep people on the dance on the same page as they take each step. So the job of the neutral is to redefine the problem in a way both sides can buy into it, which means you have to kind of get below their statement of the problem to some, well, it's the problem is that, you, husband, are a bully. No, says the husband. The problem is you, spouse, are, untrustworthy and you betrayed me. And the mediator says, well, thank you for those problems. The problem is, how can we fix this for the children? And now we've redefined the problem. And hopefully they both buy into it. But until you get there, they're stuck at the problem. The next thing humans want to know is, how do we get here? Given this problem, what's the story? And if you tune into any congressional hearing, that's what's going on at the congressional hearing. Something bad happened and people are testifying that it's the other people's fault, that's why we got here. Now, I think causes, which often are where blame comes in, is the kind of thing mediators ought to finesse. And that is say, well, there may be many reasons and many stories about how we got here, but we're here. So let's see where we can figure out a way to move forward and agree to disagree on our stories. Because in fact, causation, even in science, is always indefinite. And so getting agreement on causes, you can stay there for a long time and go nowhere but circles. But they will want to go there. So it's really important that you know about C. And then finally, third, answers. So each side will have their favorite answer. Well, you should give me the house, or, well, you should, forego alimony. And you have to move them off commitments to those answers to options, which is the classic getting to yes insight. And then you have to sell them. And the last thing is, what's the best solution for all, relatively speaking, that's better than status quo? And so you have to make the offer, and this is where persuasion comes in. You offer the evidence, the justifications, the reasons that both sides can buy into, at least in part, that allows them to say, oh, well, okay, I'm going to concede part of my favorite answer in exchange for part of their favorite answer, and we'll come to some, something that gets us there. The thing about this structure, PCAN, is that it applies in all cases of issues of policy. So if you're in your firm trying to make an argument about strategy, it's exactly the same format that you're going to have to use eventually with the team that's trying to devise a strategy, because you're going to say, well, I've got this strategy suggestion. Here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's how we got here. We don't have an office in China yet. Here's my proposed answer, which is it's feasible, it's legitimate. We can partner with another law firm that's already there, or whatever it is. But now here's why it's the best answer, all things considered, against doing nothing or anything else. And so your argument will structure better, it will be more persuasive, and your audience will follow it if this is what you do, because in the end, that's what their minds are doing anyway. And I think in mediation, it's really important to recognize that this is where it can go off the rails. It can go off the rails at any one of these 4 steps. And that it's not about negotiation, really. It's not about interest necessarily. It's about the structure of the rhetorical problem. And so I offer that to you as a perspective. And then, images, you all know this implicitly, better metaphors eat data for lunch. If you have data, but no story about the data, you're not going to be persuasive. It's just going to be a bunch of numbers. So I think usually it's really important. Lawyers know this when they're in tort cases. That's the $1 million metaphor. What's going to be the metaphor that's going to keep the jury on your side. And I think when you're in the room, people will bring implicit metaphors. If you treated a dog like you're treating me, you'd be arrested. That's a perspective on the other side. Where I live, we still believe in handshakes. You gave your word. That's another metaphor. And, culture, age, all these variables that come into who people are will affect the metaphors that they find persuasive. I would just offer this perspective, and then we'll get the personality. I learned this as a teacher early, and I think it's why I'm a successful teacher in my little world. A mentor told me, went to a class, listened to me teach, and then came back afterwards and said, Richard, you know a lot. Let me offer you a perspective. No one in your class will ever learn anything except on the foundation of what they already know. And so your job is to build a bridge between what they already know and what you're trying to tell them. And metaphors are really good bridges, and they're very efficient. If you can say, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the moment when the Kennedy brothers were sitting there and they were being advised by their military people to bomb Cuba with the surprise attack. And you may remember Robert Kennedy gave a little note to his brother in writing, and the note said, "Now I know how Tojo felt just before Pearl Harbor." And when John Kennedy read that note, the whole meeting changed, because that metaphor projected him into the role of the Japanese emperor bombing Pearl Harbor. And he didn't want to be that person. And so from there on, it was, okay, that's off the table. How else can we solve it? So that one metaphor, which Robert Kennedy came up with, in the moment, was actually enough to completely change the course of history. And that's what you're looking for in the room. What's the metaphor that you can make that sells the proposal, that sells the agreement, that sells it makes it seem vivid and likely and fair and legitimate and part of their tradition to them. And that's hard. So you have to be trolling for that all the way through the process. And so in the end, the world's complex. You have to make it simple. The world's uncertain. You have to, recognize that they work on beliefs, not on uncertainty. The world's slow to change. Your job is to inject urgency to move them to action. That's where deadlines and other things come in handy. And the world is, in fact, fact-based, but stories are what give facts meaning. And so you have to be a gifted storyteller to bring those facts to life. So this is just a little template of things you might want to think about when you feel you're in a tough spot. And just realize, well, maybe I'm making it too complicated. Maybe I'm not respecting the fact this is a belief. What can I do to inject urgency that I haven't done already? And what's a story I can tell about what this is all about and what's going to happen if we don't resolve it? Personality, which is the assessment you gave, is something I've used for decades, and I got it from the Thomas Kilmann instrument in the first place. I was working at the Harvard Program of Negotiation. This was part of the curriculum I inherited early in my career, and I really think it's insightful and important that people have. You can't give this to your parties and here, take this assessment, then I'll know how to deal with you. In a negotiation sense, it helps if you know your own style and have some sense of your own personality and the intuitions. Because this isn't about behavior, it's not about skill. There's one person we talk to more every day in our lives than anyone else, ourselves. And so this is kind of unpacking the conversation you're having with yourself when you're in a conflict or negotiation mode. And the voice that's coming up from below is, hey, let's get along to get along. Let's get along and just kind of give something up and get along. Or let's avoid this. Let's sidestep this. Let's defer it to another day. Or let's split the difference. let's get this behind us. Or this is an interesting problem. Let's unpack it and spend lots of time on it and get all the interest and really drain it. Or I'm going to win. How do I figure out where to get in this room so I can win? Those are the impulses coming up. They're based on stimuli. And some are more vivid than others. And that's why the assessment's helpful, because if you score a high score on one of these, it's going to tend to make it more of a persistent voice. If you score low on it, it'll be a dimmer voice. And you can still do all these things, of course, but you're going to have a bias about which ones you get to first. And then you have to talk back to that voice a little bit when your judgment says, wait a minute, this is not really an appropriate situation for this voice to dominate. So Jeff, you and I were talking before the program started, and you told a very interesting story about your own taking of this assessment and an insight you had. So I wonder if you could share that.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Being just a little vulnerable about it, I mentioned to you that when I took the assessment last night, I was a little surprised at how high I scored on the avoidance scale. And I was, triggered all sorts of thoughts about my upbringing and how my parents behaved towards conflict and all that sort of thing. And I was thinking about a personal situation with a family member where we're trying to work out a solution to a problem. And I thought to myself, gee, you know, I am in too strongly in the conflict avoider or perhaps accommodator mode. And maybe it's time just to say, look, there's a way this thing should come out. It's fair to everybody. It kind of goes by the rules of such situations. And it gave me the insight to fight my instincts and fight my tendencies, where doing so wasn't really serving anybody's interests, least of all mine.
Yeah, and I think that's what happens when you take an assessment and you're honestly answering the questions. You know, the questions are obviously going to change the answers depending on situation and you're talking with. But if you do it in a neutral frame of mind where you're just saying, well, on balance, which of these two things feels more like, you know, comfortable for me or the place I like to be, and you just sort of answer them all 30 times, and you get a pattern where you know, you defer the conflict, you know, you like, you know, you have peace and harmony as a preferred way to operate, and you see the pattern, then you recognize the voice of, oh, maybe we shouldn't just wait another day and see if this doesn't go away, or maybe somebody else will come and they'll do something and I won't have to deal with it. And you recognize that's a pattern, and it's often functional, but in certain situations, it's one your judgment might override. And so that little moment, that synaptical moment based on the assessment, I thought was just a classic situation where it added some value. My older son did a mediation program at his high school back in the day. He went to Germantown Friends High School, which is a friend's school out here outside of Philly. And they have a 6-week period in the winter semester where they go do community service, and they just stop school for the class and out they go. And he got in a community mediation program in one of the neighborhoods in Philly, and they gave him this assessment as part, it was the Thomas Kilman version of it, but they gave him this as part of his sort of onboarding and stuff to help him think about mediation. And he scored, his 2 high scores were in accommodation and collaboration. And he went through that mediation program like a hot knife through butter. The feedback was, he's gifted. He knows how to do this. He's like, you know, he's got the instincts. And it occurred to me in light of that one data point that being high avoider means you're diplomatic, you're tactful, you look for ways to diffuse confrontation. It's an automatic processing thing. You did it before your kid's wedding and you didn't want to create the seating that would cause people difficulties, you know. And collaboration and problem solving is sort of this deeper dive into what the situation is, what the real problem, how can we bring people to some understanding about a common problem. And that's also, if you're high in that automatic pilot, you know, you love to unpack problems like that. You love the process of socializing problems and getting them out. And the other 3 are perfectly legitimate things. Accommodations about empathy and wanting to help other people. Compromise about, you know, kind of closing and finding good standards or reasonable standards that can just face-saving standards that get us out of this problem. And then competitiveness is, you know, trying to win. With certain situations, you want to get a better price for a car. You know, it's good to be competitive and not silly about that. So, but I did think it was interesting that avoidance and collaboration are 2 behaviors that mediators use a lot. And if the assessment were to show that you were high in them, either by virtue of having a lifetime experience, which, you know, that can affect your scores, or just by predisposition, that's sort of interesting news for a certain kind of mediation context. I mean, I personally think people trust other people who are like themselves. And so it could be that if a very competitive person is in the mediation, they may need to see a flash from you that you're willing to stand up for yourself in the process in order for them to go, oh, okay, well, this person's, you know, got a backbone, so I can trust them a little bit. You know, they're not going to get manipulated by the other side or whatever fantasy's going on. I mean, there's a wonderful quote. I'll get you to my next slide on this. So why it matters, I think, is it's a source of behavior. And, you know, it's easily overridden by judgment, but it's still there. And then the impulses can be important, and it's good to know about them. This gets me to the insight I was about to share. It's also important because the thief thinks everybody steals. And that's an American folk saying. But if you're highly competitive, you really believe other people are competitive somewhere, until they prove they're not. And it's hard to get to that place. And just think of our last president, competitive person. You know, we got no value judgments about anything else about him, just competitive person. We can agree. What do you think he thinks everybody else is? A really competitive person that can't be trusted. And there we go. From that kind of sense of the world, a lot of stuff begins to make sense about predicting the behavior. I actually wrote one of my favorite articles of my own in recent times was an article I wrote for the Negotiation Journal called Transactional Man. You can find it there. And it's a whole download on Trump's bargaining style, including how he got through his real estate career and his branding career and predictions about how he might manage the presidency. And I think, you know, the thief thinks everybody steals helps a lot to unpack any judgment you might have about that. Confirmation bias is behind it. We look for things that, you know, we see things we're looking for. And if we're competitive, we look for signs other people are competitive, they become more vivid, and then we say we're right, and then we can start acting the way that's appropriate to that. The same thing, of course, works the other way. If you're highly accommodating and not very competitive, then your confirmation bias will be toward looking for the good in others and how to get them to trust me. And that will often mean you do things for them to build trust, which is the normal way to do it. But you're expecting reciprocity, and a highly competitive person may see that as weakness, and then they take advantage. And then you haven't built any credibility because your confirmation bias is leading you down the wrong path. So that's when you need to like reverse engines and not get angry at them. They're just being who they are, but just change your tone. And then finally, we can misconstrue behavior, your parties will especially, based on personality differences, because they'll think that this competitiveness is intentional and tactical, and actually it may just be a part of their personality. You know, I've worked with the United Food Commercial Workers, I mentioned that earlier. They're a very blunt, direct culture. They're a 2 on avoidance with each other, not to mention the people they negotiate with. So if you're with a negotiator from their group and they're being blunt, direct, and sort of pound on the table, you may think this is a tactic. They're trying to manipulate, they're trying to bully us. No, it's not part of their tactical playbook. It's who they are. And if you want to get to them, be blunt, direct back. And then people will go, oh, I can deal with this person. I can understand them because they're like me. So the fundamental attribution error is just another robust psychological dimension, which is you know, we tend to explain our own behavior by virtue of circumstance. We're speeding down the highway because we have to get the emergency room and we have to meet our spouse there because there's an important issue for our child. But when we view other people, all we can see is their behavior. And so when we see a speeding car racing by us on the highway, we go, there's a reckless driver who's going to kill someone, and they're a bad person, even though they are speeding toward the emergency room in order to get to their spouse, to get to their child. So we had this attribution error. We excuse our own behavior, we blame and attribute character evidence to others. And this is a problem, and you have to be careful that you don't misattribute the behavior that's happening as intentional when it's actually unconscious and personality-based. So that's, and I talked a little longer than I thought. I thought I'd be interrupted constantly, but you're very generous and you listened to me the whole time. But we got 5 minutes. Don't forget Phil Abundance. Jeff and Jean, I'll turn it over to you. Anything come up?
Wow, Richard, what a presentation. So chock full of gems of wisdom and insight. Thank you so much. Jean, in the few minutes that we have, are there some questions that our audience has posed?
Can't hear you, Jane. You're muted, Jane.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So maybe you can take down the unshare the screen then. I think everybody's got Phil Abundance there so we can see each other better.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Fantastic. I tell you, the chat is just filled with comments of love and respect and all kinds of other wonderful things for you. We can print that out later, but things like fabulous presentation. I trust Richard Schell. He is very credible. It may be a kid. Anyway, it goes on and on and on. And there are no real questions in here, just adulations, if you will.
Let me ask a question, Richard.
Okay, sure,
when you're in a negotiation situation, whether on your own behalf or as a mediator, and you sense this is just not going well, something's not right here, what's the what's the first thing that should run through our mind diagnostically in terms of how can I turn this situation around when it's not going well?
Okay, I have less experience in mediation than I do in negotiation. So I'll start with that disclosure and disclaimer. But people do come to me a lot with negotiation problems for consulting purposes, and they never come unless the problem is close to impossible, because I'm the court of last resort. But when they do, I have a decision tree, and it breaks in two directions right away. So I'll share that with you, because basically, something's wrong, people are stuck, and or people are being kind of shoved and coerced into something that they feel is a disaster, and they're trying to figure out how to get out of it. The decision tree looks like this. Number one, is it a relationship problem? Number two, is it a leverage problem? Relationships are the personal part, leverage is the situational part. And the relationship problems could be they're avoiders, and you can't get them to say anything about how they actually feel. And so my tendency is to debrief a lot of what's been happening, what's going on in this conversation, how's the conversation happening? Oh, they're not showing up to any of the meetings where the real difficult stuff is going to be discussed, or they just won't respond when we ask them a tough question. So then I'll hypothesize might be personality, but the personality in the relationship problem might be they were betrayed a year ago in some contract and they're not over it, but you forgot about that. From their point of view, it's important. From yours, it just faded. All those different dimensions that are interpersonal have to do with emotions and relationships. So that's one track. And then the other is a leverage track, which is, the other party, usually the one then consulting me, thinks they have a complete advantage in the negotiation and are being bullies. And so my move there is, let's investigate this situation and find the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that they actually have, and let's analyze them a little more vividly. And then let's look at your position and see what possible losses the other side might face, small or large, if you were to walk away. And the losses could be multidimensional. I mean, it's simple. Walmart is negotiating with a tiny little products company, but they have a really kind of unique little like product for skincare or something. And Walmart says, well, here's our price. End of story. And so the guy comes to me and says, well, what do we do? It's Walmart, and we need the contract. And I go, absolutely, you don't want to break the contract. But let's think about how hard it would be to replace you. And so then you kind of go to what's the unique proposition? What would the switching costs be? What would the inconvenience be? What would the customers who've come to rely on this product think of Walmart if they dropped it? So there are all these little nuanced things that just add a little dimension of leverage to the weak guy's side, and then send them back into the room with a conversation about how everybody can win by making some small modification that's more than zero, but not anything close to what they want. So it's those two factors that I would point to first. And I guess in a mediation, when one side is bullying the other and overbearing, it could be personality. In that case, you've got that kind of problem. It could be you've triggered a belief and they think it's threatened. That could be a problem. Or it could be that they think they have all the leverage and they need to be educated a little on what the alternatives really look like. And if you don't have the influence to deliver that message, look to see who is credible to them and who they trust to deliver the message. And so those would be some things that I would think about.
And in those leverage situations, what role does reciprocity play? In
Leverage
terms of suggesting you might do this.
Yeah. I mean,
knowing what you're going to get back.
Yeah, reciprocity plays a role in all negotiations. That's a fundamental point, give and take. So you give a little, you are entitled to ask for a little. That's the way I view it. There was a wonderful, I guess we got time for this, but I'll just tell a quick story that said a woman who told me this, who was in a very tight negotiation. It was in a bankruptcy situation. They were at an impasse and she had her wits end. So finally, during the break, she went and bought a bag of M&Ms and she brought it back to the table and she opened it and poured it out on the table. And she put half the M&Ms on the other guy's side and she kept half. And then she put one M&M in the middle of the table and said, we got to get going here. I'm going to make you a concession. It's worth one M&M. And she made the concession. And then she looked at the person and says, now it's your turn. And so the guy kind of went, well, it was sort of playful, broke the mood. So he took an M&M, he put it in the middle of the table and said, okay, that's my one M&M concession. She said, that's not worth one M&M. He said, yes, it is. And she said, well, okay. And then she put two M&Ms in and she made it a little bigger. And then he cut into. So you see what happened was the M&M process broke the impasse by making it just so small, just worth one M&M. But it got reciprocity going again. So that's what you need. It's like a pump. Got to prime it.
And well, that's a sweet note on which to end the conversation, because it's 9 o'clock and we promise our audiences that we begin on time and we end on time. Professor Richard Schell from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, what a fantastic hour. Thank you so much. Thanks so much to Natalie Armstrong-Motan for founding the Will Work for Food project last year. Jean, my wonderful co-host on these webinars. Thanks so much. We had over 85 people here at the peak. Please contribute to philabundance.org if you can. Please let Natalie and us know the contributions. We'll be delighted to add them to our running total. Professor Richard Schell, this was just fantastic. Thank you once again. And with that, my friends, we are complete.
Thank you, Jeff. See you guys. Be safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.